For centuries, historians argued over a question hidden beneath the oldest cities of China. Did Chinese civilization rise from one founding people who remained in the same river valley for thousands of years? Or was that continuity an illusion created by dynasties, language, and written history? The question seemed impossible to answer because the first farmers left no biographies, the earliest villages left no readable records, and most human DNA decayed in the soil long before laboratories existed. Then scientists began extracting genetic fragments from teeth and the dense bones inside ancient skulls. They compared people buried beside the Yellow River, the Amur, the West Liao, the southern coast, Taiwan, the Tibetan Plateau, and the borderlands of Southeast Asia. A pattern appeared that looked at first like the result promised by a viral headline. Modern Han Chinese showed a powerful connection to ancient millet farmers from the Yellow River. But when researchers examined the oldest people from southern China, the apparent answer broke apart. Another ancestry had been there all along, and modern China could not have formed without it. The discovery did not show that Chinese DNA matched one ancient civilization, while Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Indus people, and every other civilization failed. No scientific team performed in that global competition. Ancient Egyptians and Mesopotamians were not alternative candidates for the origin of the Chinese population, and researchers do not determine civilizational descent by lining up a few maternal or paternal haplogroups. The famous claim about 11,670 people came from a large modern Han Chinese genome project, not an ancient DNA ranking of every civilization. That data set consisted of low-coverage genomes from Han Chinese women and was created mainly for medical and population research. It did not reveal a single prehistoric winner. Yet beneath the invented ranking was a verified result powerful enough to stand on its own. Genome-wide studies show that the ancestry of many modern Han Chinese is strongly connected to Neolithic farmers who lived in northern China, particularly populations related to the Yellow River Basin. In a major 2021 analysis of ancient East Asian genomes, researchers estimated that Yellow River farmer-related ancestry contributed roughly 59 to 84% of the ancestry in sampled modern Han groups. That is an enormous legacy. But the remaining ancestry was not meaningless noise. Much of it reflected populations related to ancient southern East Asians, including communities connected to the rice-growing regions and coasts of southern China. The true story was not one match. It was the meeting of two ancient worlds. To understand why that meeting matters, we have to go back before China, before the Yellow River villages, and before anyone planted millet or rice. Modern humans reached East Asia tens of thousands of years ago. One of the most important early genomes comes from Tianyuan Cave, near Beijing, where a man lived around 40,000 years ago. His DNA placed him on an early branch related more closely to later East Asians than to ancient and modern Western Eurasians. But he was not simply a direct, unchanged ancestor of every person living in China today. His genome also revealed that early populations in Eurasia separated, interacted, and sometimes disappeared in ways no modern national boundary can represent. By the end of this ice age, East Asia contained more genetic diversity than survives in the region today. Ancient genomes from northern and southern China reveal that populations living 9 or 10,000 years ago were more differentiated from one another than modern northern and southern Chinese people are now. The country that appears relatively continuous today was once divided among deeply separated hunter-gatherer populations. In the north, early people from Shandong and nearby regions carried ancestry described as Northern East Asian. Farther northeast, hunter-gatherers around the Amur River had another related but distinctive profile that showed remarkable continuity over long periods. In the south, individuals buried along the coast of Fujian carried southern East Asian ancestry. In Guangxi, near the modern border with Vietnam, researchers found an approximately 11,000-year-old person whose ancestry represented another branch that does not survive in unmixed form today. That individual, known from Longlin, changed the map. His skull had once encouraged speculation about unusual or archaic origins. DNA showed that he belonged within the broad East Asian branch of modern humans, but his population had separated deeply from the northern and southern lineages sampled elsewhere. Later, people in Guangxi carried mixtures of local Longlin-related ancestry, Fujian-related ancestry, and ancestry connected to ancient hunter-gatherers from Southeast Asia. This mixing occurred between roughly 9,000 and 6,000 years ago, before farming became dominant in the region. The implication was impossible to ignore. Southern China was not an empty frontier waiting for Yellow River farmers. It already contained several populations with their own long histories, and those populations were already mixing with one another. At approximately the same time, two agricultural systems were emerging in different parts of what is now China. Northern communities cultivated broomcorn and foxtail millet in the Yellow River and West Liao regions. Southern communities gradually domesticated rice around the Yangtze basin. These were not copies of wheat and barley farming from the Fertile Crescent. China became one of the world's independent centers of plant domestication. The Yellow River Basin produced several major Neolithic societies. Yangzhou communities, beginning around the 5th millennium BCE, built villages, made painted pottery, cultivated millet, raised animals, and developed increasingly complex social systems. Later, Longshan societies constructed walled settlements, expanded craft production, and created stronger social hierarchies. By the late Neolithic and Bronze Age, the Central Plains became central to states later associated with Erli Tu, the Shang, and the Zhou. This archaeological sequence created the idea of a single cradle. The Yellow River was called the Mother River of Chinese civilization, and there is strong evidence behind that title. But the phrase became misleading when it was treated as a biological claim that one northern population generated everyone else. Ancient DNA from 55 individuals in the Yellow River, West Liao, and Amur regions showed that northern China was not genetically frozen. Yellow River populations changed through time. Late Neolithic people had more affinity with present-day Southern Chinese and Southeast Asian populations than earlier Middle Neolithic Yangzhou individuals. The movement was not only north to south. Southern ancestry also moved north. This is the first major reversal. Even inside the supposed genetic heartland, the ancient population was already absorbing people connected to the south. The arrival of rice cultivation in parts of the Central Plains may have involved migration, as well as the movement of crops and knowledge. Researchers found a growing southern genetic affinity in Yellow River populations during periods when rice farming intensified. Ancient DNA cannot tell us whether every southern migrant personally planted rice, but the timing suggests that food systems and people sometimes traveled together. Farther northeast, the West Liao River Basin provided another warning against simple continuity. Middle Neolithic populations associated with the Hongshan cultural world carried mixtures of Yellow River-related and Amur-related ancestry. As millet farming became more important during the late Neolithic, Yellow River-related ancestry increased. When pastoralism expanded during the Bronze Age, Amur-related ancestry increased again. Changes in the economy coincided with movements of people. The genome was recording climate, food, and migration in the same sequence. By around 3000 BCE, Yellow River farmer-related ancestry had expanded widely. It reached the upper Yellow River near the Tibetan Plateau, the West Liao region, and later regions farther south and southwest. This expansion probably helped spread early forms of Sino-Tibetan languages, although genes cannot prove which language every ancient individual spoke. Linguistic research, archaeology, and genetics together support a northern Neolithic center for the family, but the details remain debated. On the Tibetan Plateau, the story became even more complicated. Some modern Tibetan groups derive a large majority of their ancestry from populations related to Upper Yellow River farmers, but Tibetans also carry ancestry from earlier plateau populations and a famous high-altitude adaptation involving the EPAS1 gene. The adaptive haplotype ultimately came from Denisovan-related archaic humans and helps people function in low-oxygen environments without producing dangerously thick blood. Yellow River-related migrants could not simply walk onto the plateau and replace everyone. Their descendants succeeded partly because they mixed with people whose ancestors had already survived at high altitude and carried the biology required for that landscape. Agriculture, migration, and ancient adaptation met in the Tibetan genome. The southern story was equally important but harder to recover. Heat and humidity destroy DNA, so early genomic maps included far more northern samples. That sampling imbalance made the Yellow River appear even more dominant. When scientists finally obtained ancient genomes from Fujian and Guangxi, the missing southern world became visible. Neolithic people along the Fujian coast carried ancestry connected to populations that later contributed strongly to indigenous Taiwanese and Austronesian-speaking peoples. The Austronesian expansion eventually carried languages and ancestry from Taiwan through the Philippines, Indonesia, the Pacific, and as far as Madagascar. This means ancient southern Chinese ancestry did not merely survive as a minor layer inside Han populations. It participated in one of the largest maritime expansions in human history. Research on ancient Taiwan found that prehistoric island populations carried mostly ancestry related to a southern lineage widespread among modern Austronesian, Tai-Kadai, and Austroasiatic speakers. They also carried a smaller northern-related component. Once again, the direction of movement was not one simple arrow. Northern and southern lineages had mixed before or during later expansions. On the mainland, northern farmer-related ancestry spread south over thousands of years, but the migrants did not encounter one southern population. They encountered a mosaic. Some groups carried Fujian-related ancestry, others preserved Guangxi-related ancestry. Still others had connections to ancient Southeast Asian hunter-gatherers. As farming, states, warfare, trade, and language expansions reshaped the South, these ancestries mixed in different proportions. Modern Southern Han Chinese therefore carry substantial northern Yellow River-related ancestry, but they also retain more southern East Asian ancestry than northern Han populations. The result is a genetic cline rather than a clean border. As one moves from north to south, ancestry changes gradually. There is no point where one Chinese race ends and another begins. This cline exposes another problem in the viral script. It claims modern Chinese genetic diversity is surprisingly low, and that this proves one recent founding population. Han Chinese do share broad genetic continuity and are closer to one another than populations separated across different continents. But large studies detect clear regional structure. Northern, central, and southern Han populations can often be distinguished statistically. Geography, dialect, migration history, and local mixture all leave signals. A person from Guangdong is not simply a Yellow River farmer transported south with 25% local ancestry added by a universal formula. Different southern regions experienced different migrations and retained different connections to Tai-Kadai, Hmong-Mien, Austronesian-related, and other populations. Exact ancestry percentages depend on the ancient reference populations and statistical model used. Numbers from one study cannot be applied to every person in a province. One of the clearest contrasts came from people buried on opposite sides of the country during the early Neolithic. Individuals from coastal Shandong in the north carried a profile related to later northern East Asians. Individuals from Fujian in the south carried a different profile, connected more closely to populations that later contributed to indigenous Taiwanese and Austronesian speakers. They were not separate species, and both ultimately belonged to East Asian lineages, but the distance between them was greater than the average difference separating many northern and southern Chinese people today. Several thousand years later, that distance had narrowed. Later, northern individuals carried more southern affinity, while northern-related ancestry became increasingly visible in the south. The change is exactly what we would expect if farmers, traders, spouses, refugees, and expanding states moved between regions. It is not what we would expect from one population remaining sealed inside one valley. This gradual convergence also explains why modern DNA can create an illusion of a single ancient source. When two populations mix repeatedly, later descendants may cluster closely together, even though their ancient ancestors were once distinct. A modern sample captures the result after thousands of years of contact. Ancient DNA interrupts that process and shows earlier stages before the boundaries blurred. That is why researchers cannot simply take modern Han genomes, compare them with one Yellow River cemetery, and declare every other ancient population unrelated. The answer depends on the age and location of the samples. A Middle Neolithic farmer from the Central Plains is not identical to a late Neolithic person from the same broad region. A southern coastal hunter-gatherer is not identical to a later rice farmer. One cemetery may represent relatives, migrants, elites, laborers, or a small local community, rather than an entire civilization. Ancient genetic studies therefore use several methods together. Principal component analysis shows broad relationships. Shared genetic drift reveals which populations have closer histories. Mixture models estimate whether a group can be explained through combinations of reference ancestries. Radiocarbon dates establish when individuals lived. Archaeology supplies their food systems, objects, and burial contexts. None of these tools alone can identify an ancient nationality. The more carefully researchers asked the question, the less the answer resembled a ranking. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus Valley were not losing contestants. They belonged to different regional histories. The meaningful comparison was between the ancient populations inside East Asia that actually contributed ancestry to later Chinese communities. This shift also means continuity should never be confused with sameness. A river valley can preserve a strong ancestral core while receiving new people every century. The descendants remain connected to ancient farmers, but the population around that core continues changing. Continuity and mixture can exist at the same time without contradiction. The same caution applies to Y chromosome haplogroups. Haplogroup O is common among many East Asian men, and certain branches expanded dramatically during the Neolithic. But a Y chromosome follows only one paternal line. It cannot represent a person's complete ancestry, much less prove that 60% of Yellow River skeletons belong to one lineage, or that billions of people descend from one civilization without mixture. Maternal and paternal markers are useful clues, not complete population histories. Whole genomes tell a more complicated story. They show that the modern Han gene pool was shaped by repeated north-south mixture, regional expansions, and historical mobility. A northern-related core became widespread, but it absorbed southern populations rather than erasing them completely. Later empires moved soldiers, farmers, officials, prisoners, and refugees across enormous distances. War and famine repeatedly shifted populations inside the country. The Qin and Han states connected regions through roads, military colonies, taxation, and administration. Later periods of division drove northern populations south, especially during conflict. The Sui and Tang linked China with Central Asian trade networks. The Mongol conquest brought political rule from the steppe. The Manchu conquest created the Qing dynasty. These events left ancestry in particular families and regions, but no conquest replaced the enormous agricultural population of China. Still, describing the Mongol or Manchu genetic contribution as almost zero would also be misleading. China is vast. Northern frontier populations, former garrison communities, ethnic minorities, and local Han populations experienced different levels of gene flow. Political conquest does not require mass replacement, but neither does cultural absorption make every biological contribution disappear. Western China provides the strongest evidence that no wall isolated the region from Eurasia. Ancient genomes from Xinjiang and the eastern steppe contain mixtures involving ancient North Eurasian, Iranian-related, steppe pastoralist, East Asian, and other ancestries. The Tarim Basin mummies did not prove that Europeans founded Chinese civilization. Their genomes revealed an isolated local population with deep ancient North Eurasian-related ancestry, while later people in Xinjiang carried extensive Western and Eastern mixture. These frontier histories interacted with Chinese states without becoming the primary source of Han ancestry. This is why comparisons with Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus civilization misunderstand the question. Chinese civilization did not need biological descent from the people who built Uruk or the pyramids in order to develop cities, bronze technology, states, or writing. Ideas can travel without mass migration. Similar inventions can arise independently. Trade can connect distant societies without turning one population into the ancestor of another. Archaeology already showed that millet and rice were domesticated in East Asia. Chinese writing also developed its own structure, with the earliest universally accepted substantial texts appearing on Shang oracle bones around the late 2nd millennium BCE. Marks on much older Neolithic objects may have carried meaning, but they are not confirmed as a complete writing system. DNA cannot prove the invention of writing because scripts are cultural information, not genetic mutations. Genetics can answer a different question. How closely were ancient people related to later populations? For the Yellow River, the answer is strongly. Ancient farmers from the region contributed a major share of ancestry to modern Han Chinese and to several other East Asian populations. Their demographic expansion was one of the most important events in the formation of present-day East Asia. In that limited sense, the viral headline points toward something real, but only one matched fails at the exact moment the science becomes interesting. Modern Han Chinese do not match one ancient civilization to the exclusion of all others. They descend from populations related to Yellow River farmers, Southern East Asians, and additional regional groups. Yellow River populations themselves change through Southern gene flow. The people of the South were not strangers after Chinese civilization was complete. Their ancestry helped form the population that later carried Chinese languages, states, and culture across the region. Even the category Han is historical. It expanded as a political and cultural identity over many centuries. People from different regions entered it through state incorporation, migration, intermarriage, language shift, and local choice. A shared identity can become widespread without every family having identical ancestry. Culture can unify what genetics still records as a gradient. That may explain the appearance of extraordinary continuity. Dynasties fell, but new rulers often governed dense farming populations already connected by writing, administration, trade, and ritual traditions. States could collapse without emptying the countryside. A new elite might replace an old court while villages remained. Continuity came from millions of people, not from a genetically sealed imperial bloodline. The result is both more stable and more dynamic than the reference script suggests. Northern Chinese populations preserve strong ancestry related to ancient Yellow River farmers. Southern populations preserve that ancestry too, alongside deeper southern lineages. The Central Plains repeatedly absorbed migrants. The South repeatedly absorbed northern settlers. The Plateau combined farmer ancestry with ancient highland survival. The Northeast shifted as millet farmers and pastoralists moved. The Northwest became a meeting ground of Eastern and Western Eurasia. There was no single, untouched source. There was a center of expansion surrounded by other centers of life. The distinction matters because a simple origin story can become a claim of biological ownership. If one ancient population is declared the only true ancestor, people with stronger southern, plateau, steppe, or minority ancestry can be treated as less authentic. The DNA rejects that hierarchy. Chinese population history contains many layers, and modern nationality cannot be measured by the percentage of Yellow River ancestry in a genome. The ancient southern people whose genetic profiles no longer survive in unmixed form were not failed branches. Parts of them remain in later populations. The Guangxi lineages mixed before farming. Fujian-related ancestry traveled toward Taiwan and the Pacific. Yangtze-related farmers contributed to southern Chinese and neighboring populations. Northern expansion transformed these regions, but it did not make their earlier inhabitants vanish without descendants. This is the final reveal hidden inside the title. When scientists compared ancient Chinese genomes, one ancestry did appear again and again near the center of modern Han Formation, the ancestry of Yellow River-related farmers. It spread widely enough to connect the Central Plains, Tibet, parts of the Northeast, and Han populations from north to south. But it never traveled alone. By the time it became dominant across much of China, it had already mixed with the people it met. The match was real. The purity was not. For centuries, the Yellow River was described as the single birthplace of Chinese civilization. Ancient DNA did not destroy its importance. It made the river larger by showing how far its people and ancestry traveled. Then it made the story deeper by revealing the southern populations that the old narrative had placed in the background. Modern Chinese ancestry was not copied from Egypt, Mesopotamia, or the Indus Valley. It was formed largely inside East Asia through expansions and mixtures among populations whose histories stretched back before any civilization existed. Northern millet farmers supplied a major foundation. Southern and coastal populations supplied another. Highland and frontier groups added their own layers. The civilization endured not because its people never changed. It endured because new people repeatedly entered the story and became part of it. That is what the DNA finally matched.